Welcome to Trash Talk MMA, the #1 podcast for news and insight that matters in the world of mixed martial arts. Brought to you live and unfiltered from all four corners of the globe by MMA aficionado, Antoine Peltier.
Yo, welcome back to the Trash Talk MMA podcast. I'm your host, Antoine Peltier. We are Valentine's Day 2015, and while love is in the air, so is the violence. We had Bellator 133 last night, and tonight we have UFC Fight Night 60, Henderson versus Thatch. We're going to take a look at that card, see what compelling matchups are on there, discuss some of the controversy leading up to this card, and discussing people's general thoughts about this card, which, judging from the media perception, is not very good. So let's look at what the card has and take it from there. So looking at the background of this card, it's been mired in controversy. Looking at the history, there's been a lot of canceled fights, lots of injuries, a lot of people pulling out, and even yesterday we had some controversy at the weigh-ins. A welterweight bout between Matt Brown and Tariq Saffiedine was expected to serve as the event headliner. However, on January 1st, the UFC announced that Saffiedine had pulled out of the bout, citing a groin injury he sustained in training. Then on January 13th, Brown was pulled from the event in favor of a matchup with former UFC welterweight champion Johnny Hendricks at UFC 185. Subsequently, a welterweight bout between Stephen Thompson and Brandon Thatch was promoted to the main event, and then in turn, Thompson pulled out of the fight on January 30th, citing a rib injury. After UFC 183, it was announced that former UFC lightweight champion Benson Henderson agreed to step up as a replacement. Jake Lindsay was scheduled to face James Moontarsi at the event. However, on January 26, Lindsay pulled out of the bout, citing injury, and was replaced by promotional newcomer Cody Pfister. There was also an issue with Thiago Tavares, who was expected to face Nick Lentz at the event. However, in late January, Tavares pulled out of the bout, citing injury, and was replaced 5 days later by promotional newcomer Levin Mashkevili. Subsequently, that pairing was scrapped just prior to the weigh-ins as Lentz was stricken with flu-like symptoms. Further at the weigh-ins, both Patrick Walsh and James Moonsari missed weight on their first attempts at the weigh-ins, coming in at 191.5 pounds and 158 pounds respectively. They were both given additional time to make the weight limits for their respective weight classes, but made no attempts to cut further. Instead, they were both fined 20% of their fight purses, which went to Dan Kelly and Cody Pfister respectively. So based on the background of the event itself, things haven't turned out very good. As I was discussing all these previous cancellations, injuries, and weight issues, a lot of you were probably saying, who, what, who's Cody Pfister, who's James Moontarsi? If you take a quick look at the card on Wikipedia, 7 fighters on this card don't have Wikipedias, and 2 of them are on the main card. 3 on the prelims, and both fighters on the one and only prelim. So, that's been one of the big criticisms of this card is it is very, very light on star power. What's interesting when we look at a card such as this, as UFC Fight Night 60, and the lack of star power, is that the UFC has also been recently criticized for bringing back Rampage and guys like Mirko Cro Cop. But putting myself in their shoes, you can see why. It's very difficult for them to promote a card like this. You can imagine that the viewership of this event is going to be next to nothing. It'll be really interesting to see what numbers come out of it, and you kind of feel bad for the guys on it because they're all taking the brunt of the criticism for simply being unknown. It's kind of a gauge of any athlete's level of stardom. If he doesn't have a Wikipedia, then you got to wonder how the hell is he competing in the biggest fight stage available. So, it's a big problem for the UFC these days. A lot of their older fighters are retiring. People are getting busted for PED usage, facing, huge suspensions, fines, being out from injury, and and they keep wanting to put on as many cards as possible. There literally is a UFC card every single week for something like the next 5 or 6 weeks. You got to start asking yourself, when does more become too much, and when are they going to start looking at a less is more approach to all this? So with all this in mind, I'm going to be looking at my preview of this card from the perspective of fights and fighters on it that I'm interested to see. So I'll be skipping over a lot of the guys because I've just simply never seen them fight and don't really have any intelligent perspective to provide on them. Looking at the early prelims on Fight Pass as well as the standard prelims, the card opens up with a lightweight fight between James Muntasri versus Cody Pfister. I know neither. Then there's a flyweight bout between Zach Makovsky versus Tim Elliott, which has generated a little bit of hype, I guess, because both of these guys are sort of fringe top 10 contenders in a very thin division. That being said, there's not a whole lot of people tuning in just to see that fight. I wouldn't be surprised if it's probably going to be a good fight, but I don't think anybody's really waiting on it with bated breath. Then there's a featherweight fight between Chaz Skelly and Jim Allers. Again, don't know him. Next up, a lightweight fight between Efrain Escudero and Rodrigo de Lama. Of course, Efrain Escudero, former winner of TUF. And just not really in any state of relevancy at this point in his career. And then there was supposed to be a featherweight bout between, I believe, the number 10 rated Nick Lentz at featherweight versus Levin Mashkevili. But Nick Lentz, that card was scrapped because Nick Lentz had flu-like symptoms just prior to the weigh-ins. So after that quick run through of all these unknown fighters on the prelims, that brings us to the main card, where once again the first three fights are all unfamiliar faces. We have Dan Kelly versus Patrick Walsh at middleweight, Michel Prazeres versus Kevin Lee at lightweight, and Ray Borg versus Chris Kalatis at flyweight. So not sure why these guys were slated for main card fights, but hopefully they'll put on a show and get some eyeballs on their skill set and see what they bring to the table. So finally, on the fourth fight of the main card, we get to a somewhat notable fight where we have a welterweight bout between Neil Magny versus Kichi Kunimoto. Neil Magny had a great 2014. He fought and won 5 times over the span of last year, and that actually tied him with Roger Huerta for the most wins in a calendar year in UFC history. The wins weren't over anyone you'd recognize, but it's still a commendable feat nonetheless. His opponent Kunimoto is also on an impressive 7-fight win streak. Again, not against any really familiar names. But, the bout's interesting in that someone's going to have their great streak extended, and someone's going to have theirs stopped at the outcome of this one, and potentially, make a pretty significant jump into the ratings in the top 15 ratings of the UFC welterweight division. Finally, in the co-main event, the fun really starts on this card with a featherweight contest between Max Holloway and Cole Miller. Max Holloway is on a 4-fight stoppage win streak and has looked great. Again, not against any ranked opponents, but he's been looking like an animal since losing to Conor McGregor. In his career, Holloway has 11 wins with 5 knockouts, so it's pretty safe to say that he'll be looking to keep this fight standing and look for the KO. Cole Miller, on the other hand, has alternated wins and losses in his last 4, and of 21 wins, holds notably 15 submissions, so it's pretty safe to say that on his end, he'll want to get the fight to the ground and look for the submission. Beyond the statistics, both are really fun, charismatic fighters. And I like both Max and Cole because they look like guys who have fun in the cage. A lot of fighters you see, they seem to be taking it all too seriously, and they're not really enjoying their time in there. And both of these fighters look like they were put on earth to do this. They really like to go in there, push the pace, always look for the finish. And I wouldn't be surprised if this fight ended up getting fight of the night. And then finally, in the main event, we have a welterweight contest between Benson Henderson and Brandon Thatch. This is going to be the welterweight debut for Benson, who's on the first 2-loss streak of his career. But really, we all know he won that last fight versus Cowboy, when they faced off for the 3rd time. And that should have made him 3-0 versus Cowboy, which is a massive accomplishment given, the recent incredible performances of Donald Cerrone. And the way that he's progressed in his career of late in the UFC, and the way Benson Henderson has been, somewhat lackluster and unimpressive since losing the belt to Anthony Pettis. I thought Benson looked fantastic against Donald Cerrone. I liked how he was switching up his strikes. He was throwing a lot of kicks. He wasn't mucking around with his hair so much like he does in the past. He looked focused. He looked in shape. And I was actually, I was really rooting for Cowboy. Cowboy's one of my favorite fighters. And there was no way that at the end of that fight that I thought Benson lost it. So, he looked shocked. Cerrone looked shocked. The ref looked shocked. The crowd was shocked. I mean, one of the worst decisions, I think, in recent UFC history. I mean, not a brutal robbery either, but, definitely, come on. I mean, when everybody looking at the fight thinks that Benson won it, you got to ask yourself, what are these judges looking at and how are they scoring the fight? Anyway, just another part of the recent controversies in the sport and something that needs to be worked on and improved. That being said, there was a lot of kind of hugging and kissing between Cowboy and Bendo before going into that fight, and I'm not surprised that fight between the two of them looked more like a hard sparring session than an actual fight where they were both going for the kill. Kind of a shame when things sort of play out like that, and I thought that Nick Diaz versus Anderson Silva was kind of in the same vein. So Ben Henderson, coming off of that difficult decision loss to Donald Cerrone in his last fight, and before that, he was actually knocked out for the first time in his career versus Rafael dos Anjos. And the final topic of interesting note of Benson Henderson coming into this fight, not only it being his welterweight debut, he just last fought Cerrone on January 18th, so he's taking this fight on very short notice against quite an interesting prospect. So his opponent, Brandon Thatch, isn't very well known, but there's a lot of hype surrounding Thatch among the press and hardcore fans, mainly because he has a record of 11 wins and 1 loss, and all of his wins have come via stoppage in the first round. So he's a very large, powerful welterweight, which will be interesting because Benson Henderson's coming up from lightweight. Looking at Thatch's wins, only 3 of them are against guys that have, again, a Wikipedia entry. The best known of his opponents would be the Brazilian Paulo Thiago, who had a small 15-minute window of fame when he beat Josh Koscheck in 2009 and Mike Swick back in 2010, but is currently mired in a 1-5 record in his last 6 fights. So, Thatch hasn't faced elite competition, but against the opponents that he's been placed against, he's looked like an absolute murderer, blasting everybody in the first round, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens in this fight. Benson Henderson tends to drag fights out. Thatch tends to want to end things quick. I guess looking at predictions, Brandon Thatch is going to want to end this one in the first, impose his power and his size on Benson Henderson. Henderson's going to want to drag Thatch into waters that he's only been one time in his career, and that one time it resulted in a loss. So look for Thatch to go for the KO early. Look for Benson to weather the storm, push the pace, keep the cardio burning, and outlast Brandon Thatch in the later rounds. So there you have it. That's my take on UFC Fight Night 60 that's happening tonight, Valentine's Day. Not an impressive lineup, but hey, sometimes these cards are the best ones. If these guys, I'm sure they're getting a great pep talk from Dana White to come out and put on a show and prove everybody wrong. And sometimes these cards put on some fantastic fights. So, I'm going to be checking them out. I hope you guys do too. The website is live, trashtalkmma.com. Check it out for all the news, my blogs, and my podcasts. My podcast is also live on iTunes. You can find it there. Follow me on Twitter. Add me on Facebook. I'd love to hear from you guys. And please give me your feedback, and we will be back soon once the Bellator and the UFC are wrapped up, and we'll recap the events and see what happened. All right, guys. Look forward to seeing you soon. Peace.
Thanks for listening to the Trash Talk MMA podcast. Be sure to visit trashtalkmma.com. And don't forget to follow Antoine on Twitter at TrashTalkMMA. Let us know you're listening. Use #TrashTalkMMA.